You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Well, hi, and welcome to another episode of Examine Life with Phil. I'm Phil, and this is my attempt to examine my life and encourage you to examine yours. This week, I'm going to be using Inference to the best explanation to examine the claims that there was serious election fraud within the last election. I do enjoy when I can using philosophical methods and tools to examine what's going on in the world contemporaneously. Just a couple of weeks ago, an old friend from college contacted me and said, "Hey, I've been listening to your podcast and it's great, and I really like how you're tying all this stuff into current events." And because of the time frame he sent me, I assume he was talking about the ones I did on political philosophy. And so I enjoy doing that when I can, and it's appropriate and useful to do so. And here, I think this probably is appropriate and useful to do so. We have all these claims of election fraud. We have counterclaims. It's messy and dicey in that some of the claims are very unclear. Some of them are a little more clear. And so then how do you figure out what's going on? Well, Inference to the best explanation can really help us with that. So I've done 2 episodes on Inference to the best explanation and using it in other settings before, but both of those were well over a year ago. That was episode 24, How Inference to the Best Explanation Demonstrates that Christ Rose from the Dead. And then I made use of it also in episode 40, Why Conspiracy Theories Are Almost Never a Good Explanation. That is, when you use Inference to the best explanation on conspiracy theories, they usually don't pass the muster. Not always, but usually. And now, since it's been well more than a year since I've done an episode on Inference to the best explanation, I'm going to run through the details of what that type of reasoning is, how it works, and some parameters for it. And then I'm going to try and dive into the details of the claims of election fraud and see where we end up. So, Inference to the best explanation, or IBE, is a very well accepted type of reasoning by philosophers and epistemologists. Now, there's some aspects of it that are up for debate as to how it works here and some technical aspects there. But the broad strokes of it are very well accepted by people who are knowledgeable about this. If you go to a philosophy conference and use Inference to the best explanation, nobody's going to say, "How dare you, you can't do that." They might quibble with how you used it and dispute some of your facts, but nobody's going to say, that's a terrible method of reasoning. What are you doing? Now, this is very loosely speaking, a type of abduction. Abduction is a type of reasoning that's used by everybody all the time. A very easy example is that a jury attempts to determine if, say, the prosecutor's explanation that the defendant is guilty is a better explanation of the available evidence than the defense's explanation that the defendant is innocent or not guilty. Or suppose you want to know why one of your friends is angry at another one, and I haven't used a Calvin and Hobbes philosophy segment in quite a while, but let's say, why is Calvin angry at Hobbes? Well, if you hear from someone else, the two of them had a fight, you might conclude, hey, that's a pretty good reason for why Calvin's angry. A fight would cause people to get angry. And it's a much better explanation than, say, aliens came in and manipulated Calvin's brain chemistry just so he got angry at that particular moment. Although if you read Calvin and Hobbes comics, that might actually be a pretty good explanation in the context of those comics based on things that happen in there, according to Calvin's imagination anyway. Now, you probably don't think these things out formally. You probably don't write this out and go, well, this is more likely than this, and so on and so forth. But at a basic level, this is a type of reasoning that I'm sure you do all the time, that we all do the time. Now, the reason why it's useful to do abduction or inference to the best explanation in a more formal sense like this is that it enables us to see and explain things that we couldn't see and explain very easily before. Just like a runner who really puts in time training can run better than someone who's just naturally talented at it. So doing formal analysis with IBE or abduction allows us to see things that otherwise might get past us or escape us. Now, as I mentioned the first time I did one of these episodes, I'm relying on a philosopher from Wayne State University, Bruce Russell's, his formulation and how he puts inference to the best explanation. But loosely speaking, what he says more or less aligns with what other people say. So if you go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and look up inference to the best explanation, you'll probably find a few things different, but broadly speaking, this is all going to be moving in the same same direction. So Russell uses a term called bumpfus to describe what he thinks are the 8 key components of inference to the best explanation, and they are background, unification, mechanism, precision, fruitfulness, elegance, scope, and simplicity. So loosely speaking, does this theory fit with your background knowledge? Is it in unity with the other things you know? Does the mechanism you're using work? Is it a good mechanism? Does it fit with other mechanisms? Is it a ad hoc thing you pulled out of nowhere just for this situation, or is it a good mechanism that you can apply somewhat universally? Is your explanation precise? Does it have precision? Does it explain only what you're trying to explain and without being too broad? Because as a general rule, broad explanations work, but they tend to be wrong in the sense that they're so broad they couldn't be wrong. This gets into some other types of philosophy that we don't need to get into, but loosely speaking, if you speak in a vague and broad enough way, you can never be wrong because you didn't say anything that can be wrong, but you've also said nothing that's of any use, and that's why your inference to the best explanation should be as precise as you can make it. His next point is fruitfulness. How fruitful is the theory? How productive is it? How much knowledge can you take from it? Then he has elegance. Is it an elegant theory? Then 7 is the scope. What's the scope of the theory? And finally 8 is simplicity, which is all of the things being equal. Loosely speaking, the simplest explanation tends to be the best. That's the very often misquoted Occam's razor, which actually says don't multiply necessity beyond causation. So if you need 3 or 4 causes for your theory to work, then that's fine, even though a theory that has 1 cause is simpler. If you need 3 or 4 causes, and that's the way it works, that's a simple enough theory in that sense. Now, there are 2 other things that I make use of when I'm doing inference to the best explanation. The first is the principle of charity. So that is, as long as you don't have reasons or evidence in favor of one of 2 options, given the choice between a malicious explanation and a neutral explanation or a virtuous explanation, pick the neutral or the virtuous explanation. Now, if you've got very good evidence that someone's acting maliciously or the malicious explanation is better, then pick that. But in the absence, where the 2 of them seem equal, go with the virtuous or the neutral explanation. So, somebody tells you something that's not true. Well, it could be that they're lying to you, or it could be that they're telling you something that they think is true and they're just genuinely mistaken. In the absence of reason to think that they're lying to you, believe that they're telling you something and they're just genuinely mistaken. And similarly, we need to make use of what Richard Swinburne has termed the principle of testimony. As long as you don't have good reasons to doubt them, believe what people are telling you, and you can see how those 2 work very, very well together. In fact, arguably, if you wanted to really push at it, you could probably collapse the principle of charity and this principle of testimony together, because they both kind of flow from the same idea. So, what is inference to the best explanation? Well, I hope I pushed you in the right direction with Bruce Russell's bumpfus acronym there. Well, I think acronym's not the right term, but I hope you know what I mean. It's early in the morning here, so I might be mixing up a few of my words. Well, anyhow, what inference to the best explanation is you want a theory that passes muster on a couple of different points. One of the first points is that you want your theory to fit and explain all of the available facts and evidence. That's sometimes called explanatory power and explanatory scope. It fits all the available evidence and doesn't leave any evidence wanting. It doesn't leave anything out. There isn't a glaring piece of evidence just sitting there that your theory doesn't explain. So this is a controversial example, but I think it makes the point, it'll help you see the point very well. One of the main criticisms that I would have against most types of evolutionary theory is it seems, if not mathematically impossible, very, very close to mathematically impossible, and the theory doesn't really explain how it is the case that it overcomes that mathematical impossibility. It doesn't have a mechanism within the theory for explaining, here's how it is the case that these extremely, in fact, that doesn't work. This vastly, vastly unlikely series of events came about so that life spontaneously evolved into all the species that we now see today. Because when you go through and calculate the odds that all the mutations would have worked that way, and et cetera, even accounting for pressures of natural selection, you come up with a statistic that is so low that sometimes it approaches like the number of atoms in the unit, 1 out of the number of atoms in the universe, or something like that, depending on which aspect you're looking at and who's doing the math. But the point is very, very low. And so that's the criticism I have, is evolutionary theory does explain a lot of the available evidence, but it doesn't explain that piece of evidence, which is the mathematical improbability we're seeing. And I know that's controversial, but it should help you see the point. Further, you want it to fit the evidence in the sense that there isn't a piece of evidence that contradicts it. So when the cops are investigating a crime, they think, well, this person, we'll say Calvin again, Calvin committed the murder. But then they know from other evidence that the murder occurred, say, at about 10:30, and they've got video surveillance of Calvin at 10:35 on the other side of town. Well, then their theory contradicts that evidence, so it's not a good theory anymore. That's pretty strong evidence that Calvin didn't commit the murder. Second point you want to look for in a good inference to the best explanation is your theory doesn't leave you expecting more evidence or more facts than there are. There are certain theories and ideas that are predictive in that they predict, well, you would find some evidence of this. For example, if you have a theory, you read a textbook or whatever, or a history book, and you have a theory, well, a battle occurred in ancient times in that particular valley. Well, that theory predicts that if you went to that valley and dug around enough and looked enough, you'd find some evidence of that. You'd find some bodies of people who died in the battle left there. You'd find arrows from the battle that was shot, weapons and things along those lines. You'd find some evidence. Your theory predicts that there'll be evidence there. And so what you want is a theory that explains the evidence we have and fits with it, but doesn't also predict more evidence that you don't see. And the best example of this is most conspiracy theories you read about on the internet. I think I've mentioned this before, but I talked on one time with a guy who was a 9/11 conspiracy theorist, and he pointed to the really grainy, poor quality video of one of the planes hitting the Pentagon and said, see, it looks like a missile. And I said to him, the video is poor quality, but you're telling me that not only were some people, at least somewhere in the military, complicit in firing a missile of some kind on their own people in the Pentagon, and you can't really fire the type of missile that would be with just a 2 or 3 man team. You'd have to have it fired from like a submarine or a plane or something, which means you're having to involve a significant amount of people at that point. And given how military command structure works, it'd be pretty close to impossible for just that plane or that submarine to do that without somebody else noticing. So you've involved a further large amount of people, and on top of that, that area of the Pentagon where it got hit, there's a big freeway that goes by there that's, as I understand it, very well traveled, because it's right near downtown Washington, D.C., so there were people driving by on the interstate who claimed they saw the plane, which means that all of them have to be on the conspiracy too. And then suddenly you've ended up with a conspiracy where hundreds, if not thousands of people are lying and in on it just for that one aspect of the 9/11 conspiracy theory. At that point, you have to just discard it out of hand, or at least you should discard it out of hand, because that's demanding more evidence than there is. If there was a conspiracy of hundreds or thousands of people just for that one aspect, meaning if you expand it to the rest of 9/11, you've got even more people involved, there'd be other fingerprints and evidence left. You can't have a conspiracy of hundreds and thousands of people without it leaving some evidence. And further, it's very unlikely and odd that they would manage to bribe or bring people who were just happened to be driving by on the freeway at that particular time. It's very unlikely they'd be able to find them and bring them all in. So that's why that's a bad theory, at least in part. At least one reason why it's a bad theory is it leaves you wanting more evidence than there is. It predicts that there would be more evidence that you don't find. Also, as a general rule, you don't want your theory to be ad hoc. Ad hoc is a Latin term that means for this, meaning you don't want to make your theory up just for this explanation alone, for this thing alone. And this can get a little messy. So what I mean by this is evolution is not an ad hoc theory in that it's not looking at, well, why are there dogs and why is the species of dog around, and saying, evolution is a good explanation of the theory of why dogs exist. It's saying evolution is a good explanation for why all species of animals exist. So it's not an ad hoc theory. If it was just about dogs, then it'd be ad hoc, and then it wouldn't be as good of a theory. Now, in some cases, depending on what you're trying to explain, your theory is kind of necessarily going to be a little ad hoc. So like if you're looking for an explanation for why there are archaeological ruins at this particular place that are dated at this particular time, well, your explanation is probably going to be like a group of people came by and built this city or town or whatever it is at that time. Well, that's kind of an ad hoc explanation. But at the same time, behind it, you're appealing to all kinds of things that aren't ad hoc, like the fact that people lived a long time ago. People build towns and cities. The forces of time take their toll on those things, and so on and so forth. And similarly with claims of election fraud. Well, if you're trying to say, my theory is there was election fraud in the 2020 presidential election, well, in a certain sense, that's ad hoc because you're only looking to explain what happened in the 2020 election cycle. However, it's not ad hoc in the sense that you can find other places and times in the U.S. and even in the rest of the world where election fraud has happened. It's not like you're inventing this idea of election fraud just out of nowhere, just because it suits your interest. So, just loosely speaking, it's not ad hoc, although occasionally, sometimes, depending on what you're trying to explain, it really is going to be just for this explanation. If Joe Biden is inaugurated come, I think it's January 20th of this coming year, well, what's the explanation for that going to be? It's going to be he got more votes in the 2020 presidential election than Donald Trump did. Well, that's a ad hoc explanation in that it's only explaining that, but it's not a bad explanation. So I hope that clears up how that can get a little muddled sometimes. Ad hocness is not always a bad thing. It kind of depends on what you're trying to explain. If you're trying to explain one thing that has a very limited scope, that it's very limited in its time and location and things like that, your theory is necessarily going to be a little ad hoc. But at the same time, even then, you should be attempting to appeal to principles and theories behind it that are broader and not ad hoc. Now, I've already mentioned this, but you also want your theory to be simple, and not in the simple sense that Occam's razor is often described in popular culture, which is all other things being equal, the simplest explanation is the best, because that's not a good explanation. It's don't multiply causation beyond necessity, which is another problem with conspiracy theories. So, this is kind of a silly example of this, but let's suppose you're looking to explain, well, I went outside this morning at my house, and it was wet outside. I actually didn't. It's winter here. It's pretty cold, but that's not the point. So you go outside your house in the morning, and it's wet. The ground looks like it's rained everywhere. And so what's the simplest explanation? That it rained, or that all your neighbors in the middle of the night got out their hoses and sprayed your house and your lawn and their houses and their lawn to make it look like it rained to deceive you. Well, the simpler explanation is that it rained. And so, all other things being equal, you should prefer the explanation, it rained over the night, to the much more complicated one of all your neighbors got out their hoses and sprayed your house and your lawn and their houses and their lawn to deceive you. And this principle of looking for simplicity applies all over the place. Like, I even talked about that in the last podcast I did on political philosophy and why we should try to keep our government simple. I talked about that in issues of criminal justice reform as to how we should try and keep that simple, because just as a general rule, the more moving parts something has, even when you're talking about a theory, like inference to the best explanation, so the more causes, the more pieces your theory has, the more chances there is for something to go wrong, the more chances there is for you to make a mistake. So, just as a general rule, keep it simple. Don't multiply causation beyond necessity. That doesn't mean that if somebody's theory is simple, but defies evidence and doesn't fit with any of the other things, it's a better theory. It's not. You need to keep all these items in mind, so simplicity is just one aspect of it. But just as a general rule, don't multiply necessity beyond causation. And finally, and this one's a little more subjective, but you want your theory to be plausible. That is, you don't want it to be incoherent in the sense of being self-contradictory, as some conspiracy theories are, and you don't want it to deviate widely or grossly from well-established or potential possibilities. So you have a theory that, say, the CIA is listening in on somebody's phone in that particular case. Well, that's somewhat plausible because you know that they can do that. It's been proven that the U.S. government does do those kind of things and can. So, and it's not incoherent, so that's a plausible thing. Now, on the other hand, let's say you've got a theory that President Trump specifically is listening in on your phone calls himself because he's very interested in what you have to say. Well, that should strike you as very implausible, just kind of on the face of it, because that's typically not how things like that work, where even if the president did want to know that kind of information, and he could get it, he'd send somebody else to do it, because that's how those kind of things work. So in the absence of evidence that that's happening, that should strike you as very implausible. And we can come up with other scenarios, and there will be some subjectivity here, because some things are going to strike somebody as very plausible that another person's going to say, no, that doesn't make sense at all. That couldn't possibly be true. A large part of the point here is, and most people are actually pretty good at this, is you shouldn't just accept a theory that comes along wholesale if it contradicts with things that you already know, with things that are well established that you've already thought through. You shouldn't just, out of the blue, if you're a Christian like me who's convinced that God has spoken to you and has interacted with you in your life and you've had personal experiences, religious experiences with God, if somebody comes along and says, hey, here's my theory as to why God doesn't exist, and as best as you can't find anything wrong with it, well, you shouldn't just accept that wholesale because that new theory contradicts what's been pretty well established and plausible in your life. And you can push that around another way and say, hey, if you're a atheist or agnostic person who's fairly well persuaded that there isn't a God because you've looked at the available evidence, you don't think it warrants to claim that there's a God, and somebody comes along and gives you a theory as to, well, here's why God exists and why he's actually been interacting with you in your life, and it seems like a good theory, well, you shouldn't just accept it wholesale right then because it's not going to be plausible to you. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't actually then go in and explore the evidence and try and see if there's something there. It just means, as a general rule, a good theory needs to be plausible in that it fits with your experience and your background knowledge. Now, since we're all human beings, our experience and background knowledge can be wrong. It can be limited. We can only have seen a very small part of what's going on, so we need to exercise some humility and do our best to explore it. But at the least, you shouldn't just change your mind on a dime and go to theories that directly contradict your own experiences and what your background information is.
Okay, so now that all that preliminary explanation on how IBE and to some extent abduction works is out of the way, we can dive into more of the meat of this situation, and I'll look at the various bits of evidence that, as best as I can tell, is pretty clear here, and go from there. Now, I am recording this on the 13th of November. So this is a Friday. I'm recording this in the evening. And as best as I can tell at this time, everything that I'm telling you is true. Now, a lot of this is up in the air, so it could well be the case that some of it turns out not to be true or was improperly reported. And if that's the case, my apologies, but I am doing the best I can here. And that's just kind of the way it goes when you're talking about ongoing issues where there's a lot of contentious back and forth and things along those lines. So in that vein, there are a couple of things that I think, there's a couple of caveats I got to get out of the way before I get into the evidence I'm going to present. First of all, There's a wealth of evidence to consider. Some of it very good, some of it very bad, most of it somewhere in the middle, and it's coming from all kinds of places. There's so much information that if I were to go through and try and do a deep dive of all of it, well, this podcast would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 or 4 hours, if not longer. And frankly, I don't think you want to listen to me for that long. And I have other things to do, like I want to spend time with my family and do other things like that. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to try and focus on a few key things that I think are important and kind of move on from there. And I hope I didn't miss anything that's like extremely telling one way or the other. But if I did, again, my apologies. I'm doing the best I can with the information I have. So in that vein, we should acknowledge up front, all reporting on the potential of election or voter fraud is inherently partisan. You're just not going to get around that. The people who are reporting saying it's not the case, there's like no evidence of it, they're almost exclusively coming from the left. The people who are opposing President Trump, and the people who are claiming that, yes, there is some of it, here's some evidence, they're almost exclusively coming from the right and or supporting President Trump. And that's just kind of the nature of the beast of the political system we've built in our country. I won't say for better because it's definitely for worse, but that's the nature of the beast and what we have to deal with. There's no way around that. Another good point here is that we should try very, very hard to avoid double standards. And what I mean by that is, if the audience who listens to my podcast, if you fit into the general demographic of American citizens who, in the way you vote and the way you support and don't support political parties, the vast majority of you are absolute hypocrites when it comes to your politics. And here's what I mean by that. I can prove, both statistically and by going back through people's social media, that a very significant amount of the people who are now claiming it's inherently immoral to even raise any types of questions about the legitimacy of this last election were the very same people crying in 2016 that Russia had hacked the whole election and therefore Donald Trump's presidency was completely illegitimate. And, on the flip side, I can use the exact same method to prove that there's a significant amount of people who are now saying, we don't trust this election, we don't believe any part of it, who were saying back in 2016, no, it's crazy to think that anybody could hack our election. It's crazy to think there could be any type of legitimate interference. So, the vast majority of people who are talking about this are absolute hypocrites. And what we should try very hard to do, which I know is very hard because it's also inherently partisan, is avoid double standards like that. Now, you could make a more nuanced and evidence-based argument and say, well, the two situations aren't roughly analogous. One trying to claim that there's voter or election fraud, and the other trying to claim that Russia influenced it through social media and things like that. And that's fair. If you're trying to do that, my criticism probably doesn't apply to you. But it does apply to a lot of people, and if general statistics hold, it applies to some people who are listening to this podcast. So if you're doing that, knock it off and do your best to try and apply the same standard fairly. I know it's very difficult to do, and all of us fail at times, but you should at least make a good faith effort to do that. Now, in that same vein, most of the objections that I'm actually hearing to claims of voter or election fraud, at least initially, are more along the lines of moral objections of, well, how dare you even make that assertion? And that's only a good objection if you know the other person is undermining the elections when they know it's legitimate. If somebody who's in a position to know, yeah, this was all above board, then goes around claiming that, well, that is immoral and they should be called out for it. But the vast majority of the people who are claiming things like that aren't in a position to know that it is the case that everything was above board, so it's pretty disingenuous to say, it's immoral, how dare you do that? Rather, the response should be, well, what's the evidence? Show me the evidence and I'll follow it where it goes. Now, if there is no evidence, if there's very little evidence, if the evidence is very uncompelling, and that's shown and then the people still keep claiming, no, there was significant election fraud, well, then you could make a claim that there's something maybe immoral and dumb about that. But if your initial response to somebody claiming, hey, I think there was election fraud here is how dare you? Well, that's wrong. Your initial response should be, I don't think so, but you need to show me the evidence if you're making that claim. just as a general rule of thumb, as I've mentioned many times before on this podcast and talking with many people, if someone's making a claim, the burden of proof is on them to show that to you. So if somebody's claiming to you, hey, there's significant amounts of election fraud in this last election, the burden is on them to show you evidence that demonstrates that. And your initial response should be, okay, I don't think so, but you need to show me the evidence. Now, a further clarification I think is important here is that in a lot of the reading I've done about this, in editorials and articles that people have referred me to and discussions I've had with people, people are completely failing to recognize the distinction between different types or degrees of evidence. And that is, there's evidence that's like so compelling it's basically proof. This is like if the cops are investigating a murder and they think you're the murder suspect, and they've got you on video holding a bloody knife over the corpse of the person who was stabbed to death. Well, that's remarkably compelling evidence that should probably get you convicted, unless there's some other weird thing going on. That's essentially proof beyond a reasonable doubt at that point. Conversely, if the evidence they have is something more along the lines of, well, you had an argument with the person who was murdered the day before that was very, very heated, and you were both screaming at each other that you were going to kill each other, and then they can't verify your whereabouts around the time that the guy was murdered. Well, that's not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It's cause for suspicion. It's cause for them to investigate you further. It's, you might want to use the legal term, it's probable cause that they investigate you and try and look for some evidence that either implicates you or exonerates you. But if that's all they got, then no jury should ever convict you of that crime, because that doesn't prove you were the murderer. And most of the people I'm reading about this, they're failing to recognize that distinction. That is, there's lots of people who are claiming there's no evidence of election fraud. And if you read them very charitably, what their meaning is, there's no proof beyond a reasonable doubt that that happened. Now, they, as best as I can tell, they're right that there's no proof beyond a reasonable doubt that it happened. However, it is not the case that there's no probable cause. It's not the case that there's no evidence that should make a reasonable person go, this needs to be investigated further. There's actually a fair amount of that. But as best as I can tell, there's no video of somebody standing over the corpse holding a bloody knife type of evidence. And just as a general rule of thumb, most of the time, whenever anybody says there's no evidence for this thing, they're giving themselves away as a slave to one side of the argument or something along those lines. Because there are a few instances in life, in the world, where it is the case that there's no evidence in favor of some position, but most of the time that's not the case. Most of the time that person is at best extremely exaggerating their position. It's very often the case that there's at least probable cause evidence for pretty much any position that anybody takes. Now that, again, not enough to get it proved, not enough that it means after you do the investigation you should think, yeah, that's true, there's something compelling there, but enough most of the time that a reasonable person should go, yeah, this deserves some explanation, some investigation, some insight. So just as a rule of thumb, whenever you read anybody saying there's no evidence in favor of this, they're letting their partisanship, their politics, or their ideology take hold of them, and that's almost certainly not true. That's almost never the case. A few exceptions, but for the most part, that's never the case. So I'm going to say right from the get-go here, and I'll probably lose some people, that as best as I can tell, and I've tried to do some research and explore what people are saying, there is no proof beyond a reasonable doubt that there's election fraud of any kind that went on in this election. But there is some evidence that's more along the lines of probable cause, the kind of thing that should prompt us to encourage investigations further, which I think is at least to some degree happening, and that's good. Or that should encourage us to put pressure on election officials to explain themselves better. Likewise, another caveat, two more caveats that I think need to be said here is the laws and procedures for voting vary considerably from state to state, and in some cases from county to county within states. So just because, say, your state managed to make mail-in voting work fairly well, which seems to be the case in places like Florida, and doesn't seem to have suffered from any significant amounts or accusations of fraud, it doesn't from that necessarily follow that other states, such as Pennsylvania, manage to do so, because the laws vary considerably from state to state, because states have more or less a pretty, not total, but a pretty high degree of autonomy over how they conduct their own elections. When people talk about the presidential election, that's kind of a misnomer. We don't really have one election in this country. What we have is basically one election for every county that all happens on the same day, and then those results are tabulated. Now, one more distinction I think I need to make, and then I'll get into some of the evidence as best as I can see it. And that is, there's also a distinction that we should make between what I'm going to term voter fraud and election fraud. Voter fraud is when a single voter does something that's illegal or votes improperly. And probably the vast majority of the time that happens, it's unintentional. Your precinct gets redrawn, so you go to the wrong place to vote. And most of the time they'll catch that and send you somewhere else. But say they don't catch that and you vote there anyway. Well, technically that's illegal, but it's not like you had nefarious or malicious intentions. Or you could do something like that with malicious intentions where you try to vote in both the old place and the new place. And probably most of the time they'd catch you doing that. But if you got away with it, that would be illegal, and that would be voter fraud. And to at least some extent, voter fraud almost certainly happens in every election, because there's just so many people voting that it's going to be impossible to filter all of that out. And probably the vast majority of it is unintentional, and probably there is some of it that is malicious. But an individual voter voting in the wrong way or attempting to vote twice, something along those lines, highly unlikely that that's going to have any substantial effect on the election. It's still illegal, and where it's found, it should be prosecuted and dealt with, but highly unlikely that's going to have a substantial effect. Now, what you should actually be concerned about is the possibility of election fraud. And that's where election officials, or in some cases third parties, do things where it's the equivalent of stuffing the ballot box, where they somehow find 100, 500, or 1,000 or more votes for one of the candidates where there wasn't really any voting. And most of the time, if they're going to pull that off, it typically has to be someone involved with election officials who's got actual access to the voter registration records and rolls, because what they'll do then is they'll go find people who didn't vote, they'll fill out ballots in their name, then it looks official, then it's very hard to actually track and prove. That's how it would have to happen if it was going to happen. And so, for obvious reasons, I'm going to try and focus on the evidence here that gives us cause to suspect maybe there was election fraud, because voter fraud almost certainly happened. And it wouldn't surprise me at all to find out that, at least to a small degree, some types of election fraud happen in every election. But is it enough to actually sway the outcome? There's a couple of different ways we can categorize what's going on here. First, is there election fraud? Second, if there was it enough that it changed the outcome? And third, is that the kind of thing you could prove in court and prosecute somebody? And those are all three different questions. And I would say there's a kind of sliding scale as to how likely you could prove that. I think it'd be a lot easier to establish that there was election fraud than it would be to establish that there was election fraud and it affected the outcome of the election. And further, it'd be even harder to establish it to such a degree that you could prosecute somebody in court, which in many ways is a good thing, because our legal system should have a high standard of proof. Okay, so this is starting to go on long already, and I was hoping that would make this a short one, so I'm going to jump ahead and just kind of work through my notes here. The first point of evidence that I think we should consider is that election fraud does happen in elections. It's happened all over many, many other countries in the world, and it has happened in the United States before. There's pretty good evidence that it happened in the presidential elections in the U.S. in 1824, 1876. It may, a lot of people think it did happen in the 1960 election, that Kennedy actually stole that election from Nixon, although that's a little bit more iffy. And some people actually think there may have been some significant election fraud in the 2000 election between Gore and Bush, although we don't know that for sure. As I understand it, there was substantiated election fraud in a Texas Senate race in 1946. And just in 2019, that is last year, a statewide election was overturned and redone, meaning they did a revote in North Carolina due to absentee ballot fraud that was proven. In that particular case, it was very unlikely that the fraud was actually going to affect the outcome. It was well below the margin of victory, but they still did a revote. And that was probably the right thing to do in that case, because there was fraud there, and so the right thing to do in the case of fraud, probably just to throw the whole thing out and do it again. Now, if you are going to commit election fraud, you need the opportunity to do so. So as a good rule of thumb, and I've taken this from other people who've done research on this, you can probably only affect the outcome of an election through election fraud if the margin of victory is around 1% or less. Any more, and it gets very, very difficult to commit the level of fraud without leaving your fingerprints all over everything, without leaving all kinds of evidence everywhere. And then of course, you're not going to get away with it. In order to do it and get away with it, where people aren't going to immediately realize, well, this game was rigged, at least in the U.S., you've probably got to have the margin around 1% or less. So you can only do it in close elections. And unfortunately, this last election was very, very close. It would have been much better for all of us if somebody had won decisively. But in those swing states, in several of them, the margin of victory is around 1% or less. So unfortunately, that gives the opportunity for that to happen. Secondly, what you typically would see happen is that one of the parties will hold back the counting of a whole lot of ballots in an area where they have a lot of ballots, where they're strong, where their party is the dominant party. It's like a stronghold. So in the case of Republicans doing it, it'd be a Republican stronghold. In this case, what we saw is in places like Atlanta, and I think Detroit, Las Vegas, and I've heard of this happening in like Milwaukee as well. You had lots of, and those were Democratic strongholds, you had them basically not seem to even start counting their ballots until well into the night on election night. At least that's the way it seems to have been. And the reason why that gives you them the opportunity for election fraud is that if you're going to commit election fraud, what you really want to do is do just enough of it to put your guy over the edge. Because if you do way too much, then it's perfectly obvious what happened, and then that defeats the whole purpose of doing election fraud. So the party that's doing the election fraud would then need to wait until they've got a pretty good idea of how many new ballots they need to find, and then they start finding them. And unfortunately, it seems like there were many Democratic strong areas that at least had the opportunity to do that. This seems to have happened in heavily populated areas that are also Democratic strongholds and also happen to be in the swing states. It doesn't seem to have happened that way in comparable areas, even comparably populated areas that are Democratic strongholds in non-swing states. We saw this problem in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Nevada, Georgia, and North Carolina. And I think maybe some people would throw Arizona in the mix there, but I actually didn't hear very much about that. But you didn't see comparable problems in, say, Florida or Texas or, to my understanding, even like California and New York. Now, the alternative explanation that we could look to here might be to say that it was due to mail-in ballots. And there were some states that had laws in place that didn't allow them to start counting mail-in ballots until like election day, and I think even in some cases until after the ballots on election day had been counted. Now, you didn't have that law in Florida. I think in Pennsylvania you actually did, so that may be a contributing factor there at least, or it may be the explanation. Now further, many of these suspected areas are reported to have got a lot of mail-in votes that arrived on election day and then weren't logged into the system until the early hours of the next morning. 1, 2, 3, 4 a.m. on the morning of the 5th. The morning of the 4th. The problem there is, at that point, the people who were doing election fraud, if that's what they were doing, they knew just how many fraudulent ballots they had to put in the system, or at least in theory they knew that, and can also know whose names to put them under, because you have lists at that point of who voted and who didn't, so they know, well, these 10,000 people here didn't vote, so we can put the ballots we need under their name, so then it's less suspicious. It doesn't look like it's an illegal vote. It looks like these people who didn't vote came to vote, and for the most part, it's pretty difficult to check up on that and see if that really is the case. Now, the possible problem with this is that unless you did a bunch of pre-planning and had ballots pre-prepared and had a good idea in advance of who would and wouldn't be voting, it might be very difficult to pull that off in just the 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 8 or 12 hours that you'd have there to start that going. Alternatively, in the cases where there were mail-in ballots where some states like Nevada and I think Pennsylvania simply mailed out ballots to everyone on their voter registration rolls, then a third party could have done that. It's entirely possible that a third party could have gone around and collected ballots from people who were dead, because there are dead people on voter rolls all the time. That's a very difficult thing to avoid. and then filled them out and sent them back in, and there'd be no way to verify, at this point anyway, or at least it'd be very difficult to verify that those ballots did come from legitimate people and not from people who were dead or moved or something like that. That was one of the major problems with how many of these states were doing mail-in ballots, is they just mailed it out to everyone on their voter rolls, and it's always the case that there are dead people on voter rolls and people who have moved, because it's very difficult for the states to keep up with that. I mean, do you notify the state voter registration every time you move? Well, no, and most places don't either, and that leads to this problem. Now, other thing you'd need to do this is you'd need a chance to do the election fraud where no one can see it. And in many places, there were poll watchers who were ejected from buildings, sent away deceptively, or kept at such a distance that they couldn't effectively see what was going on. There's a lawsuit, I don't know if it's gotten resolved yet, in Pennsylvania, where the Republican poll watchers were initially being kept as much as 30 or 40 feet away from the people actually counting the ballots, and were being forced to watch it through binoculars. Now, the lawsuit said, hey, let's get back within 6 feet, and I believe the initial ruling was in their favor, but then the poll workers there were still denying them that, and the local sheriff said, I'm not going to enforce that. So that's a clear problem, because part of the way you avoid the appearance of impropriety, the appearance that there was the potential for fraud there, is you're supposed to have poll watchers from both parties in all places where this kind of thing is going on, and then if anybody sees something weird or the appearance of impropriety going on, they can call people. Well, there were many places, I don't know exactly how widespread it is, but it's been confirmed that at least in some places, poll watchers were denied in some way or other the opportunity to watch what's going on. And that's highly, highly suspicious. Now, as I said before, all these things, none of it is a man standing over the corpse on video with a bloody knife. It's all more things along the lines of, this should give us probable cause to look into this. This should should give us cause for investigations. This should prompt us to at least be asking very difficult questions of the election officials in charge, because it looks bad. It looks suspicious. It doesn't prove there's election fraud, but it looks bad and it looks suspicious. Especially when you look at the fact that these problems seem to more or less have only come from Democratic-controlled areas in swing states, and then that adjusted the election in favor of Joe Biden. That's suspicious. Now, another thing you would want to look for if you were looking for voter fraud is that you'd want to look for very high differences in turnout or voting trends against groups that benefit or tilt to one side only. That is, you can more or less establish in the U.S. that groups tend to vote similar. That's how they can say things like, in the last election, Donald Trump lost support with white men, people who look like me, essentially. And although he didn't win ethnic minorities, he actually gained support among ethnic minorities since his prior election, because they're just looking overall at how this ethnic minority tends to vote, and they can say, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but say like 25% of them voted for Donald Trump, 75% voted for Biden, and then 4 years ago it was like 10% for Trump and 90% for Clinton or something like that. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but that's what it's like. So the other indication you want to look for is, well, is there a place where, say, it was like 99 to 1, 100 to 1, when in the rest of the country it's more like 70 to 30. And if it was like that in a particular demographic was split like almost 50-50, and then you go into another area of the country where it's like 100 and nothing, well, that would be very suspicious. In the same context, turnout tends to be, among groups especially, tends to be more or less the same. So if you find, say, one area of the country where turnout among this particular group, say, just for example, say Asians, is 90%, and then everywhere else in the country it was 30%. Well, that's very suspicious. Now, again, not proof beyond a reasonable doubt, but suspicious. Enough cause that somebody should go look at what happened there and say, well, what's going on here? So to help with this, by way of comparison, I did a little bit of digging into what voter turnout rates were in a couple of cities to try to compare them. Well, the voter turnout rate in Detroit was 49%, and that was about 10% higher than 2016. That's according to one of the newspapers that I believe is local there to Detroit. Conversely, Cleveland, right next door in Ohio that Trump won, turnout there was 62%. So at least there, it actually seems like the turnout in Cleveland was higher, so we don't see that trend there. Now, comparing, like, say, New York and Georgia, well, statewide turnout in Georgia was 63%, and Atlanta, which again is one of the places where people are suspicious, that had 65%. So that's high. But then say compare that to New York, and New York had about 56% voter turnout. So at least in these cities that I picked, and I didn't check everything, but I just picked some examples to try to look through, there doesn't really seem to be, at least in these ones I picked out, the disparity in voter turnout rates that you would expect if there was, that would be good evidence of fraud. So in this particular case, that actually gives us cause to think, well, maybe there was an election fraud. Now, somebody who's got more time than me, who doesn't have 2 kids and all kinds of stuff to do, and who could do something like this for their full-time job, somebody probably should dig into the voter rates and turnout rates of pretty much all the major places and compare them and see if there were significant anomalies, and then if so, go investigate it. But in just these couple ones I picked, and I just kind of picked them at random to try to test it, doesn't look like there's evidence of it, at least in this regard. Another sign you might look for election fraud would be anomalies like more voters voting than are registered. Now, that's not necessarily a crime or a problem, as there are some states like Wisconsin that do allow same-day voter registration. But it is rare and it is unlikely, and I do think, from what I'm aware of, this did happen in Wisconsin, where more people voted than are registered. Now, again, it's entirely possible that that's just fine, because Wisconsin has same-day registration. So you've not been registered before, you show up to vote on election day, they'll register you and let you vote. So it's possible that that's what happened. It's also possible that that's evidence of something untoward, and somebody should look into that and see if there's any other further evidence to explore, and if there is, keep investigating, digging, and if there's not, say, well, I guess a lot of people were excited to vote in Wisconsin who hadn't voted before then. You also want to look for anomalies like the counting of later ballots, like ballots that weren't counted during the initial election day or the initial night, that are in some of these same places in these same Democratic-controlled areas in the swing states, breaking for one side at rates that are inconsistent with what was expected prior. And what I mean by that is not that mail-in ballots they counted late broke for Joe Biden. Everybody expected that. What I mean is that they break for him at ratios that are much, much higher than what was predicted. And again, not proof that there's a problem, but enough that you should say, well, hang on, wait a minute here, let's look into this. And this does seem to be the case, that, at least as best as I can tell, in pretty much all these swing states, as these later, what I'll call for lack of a term, ballot dumps, although that's kind of a poor term, but that's what everybody's using, that these favored Biden at much greater margins than everyone was expecting. So prior to the election day, from the research I did, Biden's team said that if Trump won the election day votes by certain amounts, that is margins, then Trump would win the election. And Trump exceeded those expectations, and that's why when we all went to bed on the night of the 3rd or very early on the morning of the 4th, everyone, including the news media commentators and Trump's team, thought he had won the election, because they said he's going to have to perform this well on election day to win, and he didn't just perform that well, he exceeded it. Then when the mail-in ballots started coming in, so they were favoring Biden much more heavily than anyone expected. So again, not conclusive proof in any way, but it's suspicious. Another indication that maybe there's something wrong is that there were lots of ballots. I've heard reports of anywhere from like 100,000 to 250,000 that were only marked for Joe Biden, meaning whoever went in and voted marked, I voted for Biden for president, and then they didn't fill out any of the rest of the ballot. Now, that's probably going to happen to some degree no matter what when you're dealing with an election where I think like 140 million people voted, because people are crazy. But it does seem really odd that you would go through the trouble of dragging yourself to the polling place and then only voting for one candidate in one race, because you're already there. Why wouldn't you at least like mark Democrat down the board if you're voting for Biden or something like that? Now, conversely, if you're looking for evidence of election fraud, that's easy to explain, because if you're trying to essentially fraud the election and rig the system, so to speak, you don't want to mess up all the other races, because that's going to not only maybe mess up what you're trying to do, but it's also going to maybe throw an indication of fraud in there as well. When you're dealing with a presidential election, the amount of votes that are cast are so enormous that you can commit fraud at a much higher scale than you can at, say, a local election or a statewide Senate election, because the number of ballots as you go down to those local elections really decreases. So if you wind up with 100,000 more votes than you should for a local official election in a local city, that's going to raise all kinds of red flags, and then people are going to come running looking for, well, where's the election fraud? So if you are committing election fraud, only marking the race that you're committing the fraud for is something you would probably want to do. And again, doesn't prove that there's a problem, but I think it's cause to say we should be suspicious of this. And the thing that really makes me suspicious, the thing about this that I find the most troubling is that it does seem like pretty much all these errors and problems favored Biden. If it was the case, at least it seems to me anyway, that it was just a certain level of incompetence, election systems being overwhelmed by the pandemic and things like that, then you should see comparable errors pretty much everywhere along the lines, and you should see these errors favoring Biden, some of them favoring Trump. You should see errors in Republican-controlled areas and cities and in Democratic-controlled areas and cities, and you should see them kind of across the board all over the place. And if it's the case that it's just election officials in very populated areas were overwhelmed, then you should see it pretty much all over the place as well. But Florida's got tons of many very, very populated areas and cities, and it didn't seem to have any of these problems at all. Florida's got areas that are very, very heavily controlled by the Democrats, and it didn't seem to see any of these problems. So, nothing here like the man standing over the body with a knife, but any one of these things I think would be cause for suspicion, and then when you take the fact that they all seem to happen more or less together, more or less in the same areas, and more or less in areas that the Democrats controlled, and more or less it all seemed to benefit Biden, that pattern is very, very troubling and is worth looking into. That's the fact that all of these errors seem to point in one direction only is the fact that I find the most troubling. Any one of these things happens by itself in an election year, you can probably just write that off because, hey, people are incompetent. The government's incompetent. It's going to make mistakes and errors. Okay, so 2 more points I want to cover before I wrap up here. The first is that it's also entirely possible that most, or all of these errors, anomalies, or problems happen not due to election fraud, but just due to glitches and problems in the system. And the easy example of this is there was a county in Michigan where a software error from a software that's called Dominion software, which is, as I understand it, widely used in election purposes, accidentally flipped 6,000 Republican votes to Democratic votes. And the county only noticed because they always vote Republican, and when it came up as them voting Democrat, somebody said, wait a minute, something's wrong here, and they went back and looked at it. Now, it was originally attributed to a software glitch. Subsequent reporting has actually said that it's a user error, and what they're saying is that the machine had actually been configured improperly by the election officials there. So it didn't read the ballots correctly, and so that's considered human error. Now that same software that's called Dominion, which is a horrible name for election software, but that's what it's called, is apparently in use in many, many other places in Michigan and in many, many other places throughout the country. And it would seem to me that if an error like that is possible on this software, then at the very least, all the counties that use that should go check their systems and see, well, did we make the same error? Is it possible we made the same error? And in some way double check that. The New York Times actually ran an article 2 days ago saying no, Dominion voting machines did not delete Trump votes. And it was essentially trying to argue that, hey, there's little or no evidence that these things cause widespread errors. And again, we're not looking to see if there's widespread errors. What we're looking to see is there evidence or cause to say these things need to be investigated, or is there the man standing over the stabbed body with a bloody knife type of evidence? And so that what you get there again is that mischaracterization where they're saying there's no evidence, and there is no man standing over the body evidence, but the fact that it was that easy for a county to make an error that flipped their whole county from red to blue, that's a sign that, hey, people who use this Dominion software should go double check and see, hey, did this same error happen in our county? Were there other errors that happened? There were other reports out of Georgia that people were having trouble. Look, some of the election officials were having trouble with the Dominion voting machines, getting them to put out reports to the statewide officials and things along those lines. And that's very troubling because, as I understand it, from just doing some of the numbers, it was a 6,000 vote discrepancy that this error caused in that one county. And there are enough counties in Michigan that use this software that if you had a 6,000 vote error in every county that went from one candidate to the other, that would be more than enough to flip the election back from Joe Biden to President Trump, at least in Michigan. Now, I really, really doubt you had the same error with that exact number of people in every county. That seems very unlikely. But the mere possibility of it is enough that these places should at least be checking and seeing, well, did we make the same error? Can we prove that this error didn't happen? Does everything seem on the up and up? And again, it just really troubles me that for the most part, when I'm listening to election officials and people who are in charge of these processes in these states talk about these things, they're saying, for the most part, no, nothing to see here, move along. Yes, there are reports that we had problems, but we fixed them, and we don't want you questioning us on this further. That's wrong. We should be questioning them on it further. Essentially, when it comes to our election process, I think we should tend to treat the government as guilty until proven innocent, meaning the government should have to prove to us that the process was open, transparent, fair, and on the up and up, rather than us just giving them the benefit of the doubt. So one more thing to talk about, and that's because I did a bunch of research into this, and that's a thing that's called Benford's Law. Now, Benford's Law is something that's been thrown around quite a bit after the election, because it seems that some of the totals of votes that Joe Biden got in these swing states defy it. Now, Benford's Law has been used by the IRS to find anomalies in tax returns and finances for the purpose of investigation for a while, and loosely speaking, the idea of it is this. In a naturally occurring set of numbers, if you reduce it all to the first one, so reduce 1,000 to just 1, reduce 200 to just 2, reduce 30 to just 3, and so on and so forth, and do that with all those numbers. You do that with all the numbers, reduce them to just the first digit, and then add up the digits. And what you should find is a lot of 1s, some less 2s, less 3s, less 4s, and so on and so forth down to 9, and you should, if you graph them, then get a very, very nice, more or less smooth curve, with 1 being the most, 2 being a little less, 3 being a little less, and so on and so forth. And as I said, the IRS and other places have been using that to detect fraud for quite some time, so completely unrelated note, I guess a lesson from this is, if you're planning on committing tax fraud, the numbers you make up to input into the system, make sure they all start with 1. And so the claim here is that when you look at the totals of people who voted for Biden in the swing states, and especially in areas that are controlled by Democrats, they violate Benford's Law. You see things like 2 and 3 being the highest number, and so on and so forth, and that's an indication that, hey, something's amiss here. Again, unusual things happen. Benford's Law isn't like a ironclad law. It's a rule of thumb where if you see something that violates it, hey, that's a sign something's probably wrong, you need to go look into it. And it's the same would apply here. This is a sign that something seems to be wrong, so we should go look into it. Now, in reading about this, I stumbled across a guy who claimed that Benford's Law doesn't apply to Biden's vote because when you look at the statistics of how people voted in these areas, the numbers don't fit that natural category. That is, they're just too specific, so it doesn't apply. And the example I think this guy said is something like, if you weighed the average German Shepherd, which typically I think weigh like between 60 and 80 pounds, Benford's Law wouldn't work because it'd be very, very rare you get a dog that goes up into the 3-digit range, and it'd be very, very rare you get a dog that's like below 50 pounds. So Benford's Law just wouldn't apply there because the range of numbers is too small. And he was trying to make a claim like that about like Michigan and Milwaukee, as I recall, saying, hey, it doesn't work because the range of numbers is too small there. That is, not that there's too little numbers, but there's too little variance in it. You want a variance of the number of digits in the numbers for Benford's Law to apply. And so when I first heard that, I thought, well, I guess maybe that's just not a good indication of it. And so then I thought about it some more and realized, well, no, what this guy's doing is he's assuming the very thing which is in contention, which is, if you look at Benford's Law there, it's saying there's something wrong with the base set. There's something wrong with the data we're looking at. There's something in the data that's artificial. And he's saying, no, the data isn't artificial, so Benford's Law doesn't apply. So I was thinking about that a little more, thinking, well, how could you test that? And further, he said that part of the reason why Benford's Law didn't apply and why the numbers were artificial is because Biden beat Trump so badly in, I think he said specifically in Milwaukee, but in Michigan in general. And so I thought about how you could test that, and it occurred to me, well, why don't we go look back 4 years ago at the results of the 2016 election in Michigan and see if Benford's Law applies there, because if it's a problem with the way population dynamics work in those precincts and the way voting works, well, it's not going to be identical in 4 years ago, but it should be pretty similar. I mean, it's not like Michigan had 1 million people move out or something, so that was the best test I could think of anyway. So I went and did that. I went and looked up what the results were by precinct for every precinct in Michigan in 2016 for Trump, Clinton, Johnson, Stein, other, which is the other category they had, and then total. And I reduced it all down to the first number. I made an Excel sheet to do this, and if you're really curious, email me and I'll send you a copy of the Excel sheet. And anyhow, then I've just made graphs of all of them. And with one, maybe two minor exceptions, they all meet Benford's Law. All of them get that nice slope where 1 is the most, 2 is after that, 3 is the one after 2, and so on and so forth. And the two minor exceptions are on Trump's vote in 2016, the number of times 8 occurs is more or less equal to the number of times 2 occurs. So you get a nice slope on that one until you get to 8, then it jumps back up, then it drops back down when you go to 9 again. The other minor exception is when you look at the other total, which that is people who wrote in candidates, people who voted for somebody who isn't Trump, Clinton, Johnson, or Stein. The 2 is slightly higher there. So you get it goes up slightly from 1 to 2 and then dips down and you get that curve again. The total, you get an almost perfect Benford curve. Now, this didn't take me terribly long to do. It took me longer to actually figure out how to make the graphs work properly in Excel because it was originally giving me the X and Y axes in wrong places, and I had to look up how to flip that. But it didn't take me very long to do, and it shouldn't take long for somebody who's a mathematician or who works in statistics and probability to really, really get into the meat of this and figure this out. And I'm working kind of outside of my area of expertise here because I'm not trained in probability and statistics, but as I understand Benford's Law, it's not statistically complicated. You just take a range of numbers, you reduce it to the very first one, you count them all up, and you look and see if there's a nice slope from 1 to 9. And for the most part, with those two relatively minor exceptions, the election results in Michigan in 2016 meet that. And from what I've been seeing online of people reporting, the election results in 2020 don't, which is a sign there's probably a problem. There's probably fraud. There's something that needs to be looked into there. So, there's a number of different explanations that we could look to it for this. First, the extremes are you could say, well, all of these anomalies, all these problems, they're all attributable to fraud. They're all because somebody was trying to rig the system. The other extreme is where you say, well, there's nothing untoward here, there's no problems, this is all human error, this is all the system being overwhelmed, and there's no problem whatsoever. And then there is a third option where people could look at this and go, oh, this is all normal and perfectly fine. There are no problems to look at here. And that third option, it seems to me, is just nuts. There clearly are problems, inconsistencies, and at the very, very least, we have election officials who were making mistakes and didn't quite seem to know how to do their job and were maybe incompetent. Now, I think the most likely explanation is probably somewhere in the middle. Like, it does seem to me pretty likely that there probably were some people committing election fraud somewhere. Whether it was enough that it's swinging the election, well, like in Michigan, Biden's up by well over 100,000 votes. It seems very, very unlikely that they managed to put 100,000 fraudulent votes in the system. That's very, very difficult to do. But look at some other states like Georgia where he's up by only 14,000. It would be much easier to fake 14,000 votes than it would be 100,000 votes. So maybe. But what's, I think, the most likely explanation is just kind of a mix of the two. There are election officials who were incompetent. There is evidence of problems with voting software like Dominion and other errors and mistakes that happened in the process, and you're going to expect at least some of that when you have a massive amount of elections where over 140 million people are voting, or I think it was around 140. And then there are enough things that make you go, well, something's off here, like the fact that they were kicking out poll watchers to say, but there's signs to think, there's probable cause to think that something untoward was going on here. So what I would say is these need to be investigated, and at least in some places they are, because when you have an election where there's the appearance of impropriety, that's wrong. There shouldn't be an appearance of impropriety in our elections. Everything should be as on the up and up as we can make it. As I said before, when it comes to our election processes, they should be as open and transparent as possible, and it really should be on those local governments, on those election officials, to prove to us that the elections were on the up and up, not the other way around. When you're seeing problems and errors left and right, and the election officials' response is basically like, how dare you ask questions, move along, there's nothing to see here. No, that's not right. When there's problems and errors and mistakes, and they all seem to be pointing in one direction, and the officials are refusing to answer questions, that makes me deeply suspicious, and it should make you deeply suspicious too. Now, I'll add this caveat. It does seem to me to be a big hurdle to even go from this, though, and say, and there was a massive conspiracy to steal the election from President Trump, because conspiracy theories are almost never right. As I mentioned earlier on, the problem with most conspiracy theories is you would have to involve so many people that somebody's going to talk or brag. And it would seem to me that this would fall into that category as well. To pull off something like this, you would need a massive interstate operation in multiple states that was at least in some sense coordinated, that where a significant amount of people in each state and in those cities knew what they were doing and were involved. You couldn't have something like this pulled off by only a handful or a dozen of people in key positions. There would have to be a lot of people who were involved, and if you get too many people involved, especially in something like this, eventually somebody's going to talk, they're going to let something slip, somebody's going to brag or something like that. Now maybe not right away, maybe it takes, I don't know, a year or two or something along those lines, and it is the case that election fraud did steal presidential elections in this country before, but you just can't do something like that and involve that many people and keep it quiet. At least it's very, very, very unlikely. If we had, say, overwhelming evidence that there was election fraud, we had something like the man standing over the body with the bloody knife on video, we had that equivalent for this, and nobody talked, well then you would be justified in concluding there's election fraud, even though it entailed a massive conspiracy. But since we don't have something like that, the fact that it would have to entail such a massive conspiracy, that should still leave us being pretty suspicious of widespread election fraud. But at the same time, as I said, these things should be investigated, because there's more than enough probable cause here that a reasonable person should go, something doesn't look right, and these people who are involved really need to answer some tough questions, and the fact that they seem to be avoiding doing so is very, very problematic. So I know there's a whole lot more supposed data and claims flying around about this. I tried to deliberately only include things that I thought were very, very credible or very, very true. My apologies if it turns out something I said in here was deeply wrong and in error. I genuinely did the best I could. But that's how I see we can use inference to the best explanation here. Inference to the best explanation suggests there's some things about this that are deeply troubling, like if it was the fact that these election systems were just overwhelmed by the combination of the pandemic, mail-in voting, and incompetent people, well, then why wasn't the problem more widespread? Why didn't we see it in these other non-swing state areas? It is deeply troubling that it seems to have only happened in the swing state areas and only seems to have gone for Biden. That aspect of it seems to lend credibility to the idea of election fraud. Conversely, the idea that such a massive amount of election fraud, at least in places like Pennsylvania, would entail a lot of people and a lot of resources, and there doesn't seem to be evidence, at least not strong evidence of that. We're seeing more like what you would term as circumstantial or statistical evidence of it, but not like strong evidence, not like a paper trail, not like somebody confessing. Well, that does seem to lend support to the idea that, well, this certainly didn't happen to the scale that would be necessary for Joe Biden and the Democrats to steal the election. So like most things in life, there's some evidence that points one way and some evidence that points the other way, and if you had to stick a gun to my head, I'd say right now, well, the odds that there was some voter fraud in this election, 90% or better. The odds that there was some election fraud somewhere in the system, very, very good, probably like 60 or 70%, because you've got this many elections with 140 some odd million people voting. Yeah, probably somebody somewhere saw an opportunity or two and tried to cheat a little bit. And the statistical data and circumstantial evidence seems to support that. The odds that actually swaying the election away from President Trump to Joe Biden, I'd say that's much, much lower. Probably more like, I don't know, I'd ballpark it between like 20 and 40%. Not impossible, but unlikely. It wouldn't be impossible for a well-coordinated large group to pull this off, but it'd be very difficult and unlikely they could do it without leaving some more evidence other than the circumstantial, statistical anomalies that we're seeing and the, for lack of a better term, probable cause type evidence that we're seeing. And then, unfortunately, the odds that happened, and it's actually going to get proven in court because it's so much harder to prove things in court, I'd say very, very low, probably like 5 to 10%. So, I look at all this and I find it very, very troubling. It really disturbs me that our elections are not more transparent and open. It really disturbs me that the election officials seem to be resisting calls for more transparency and saying, how dare you ask us tough questions about these things. But it does at the same time seem very unlikely to me that you had enough election fraud that it swung the election one way or the other. So since this went on a little longer than I wanted it to, I wanted to make this a relatively short one. I'll just wrap it up there. Thanks for listening. I appreciate you sticking with me through this. Write in and let me know what you think. Have you run your own inference to the best explanation? Have you done Excel sheets and mapped out your own Benford curves like I have? Do you think I did any of this wrong? Did I miss anything drastically so? If so, write in and let me know what you think. You can always reach me for any kind of comment at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com or leave a comment on the Facebook page. I'm back up to running that. Just do a search for The Examined Life with Phil. And then I will be back again with something else for you in 2 weeks' time.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you are never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.